My son decided I was too old, too slow, and a burden. He placed me in a nursing home without my consent and moved into my house, treating me as though I were already dead. I remember the day everything changed as if it were a photograph left in the sun until its edges curled. It was ordinary in the way that ordinary things always are right before they fracture. A slow, ordinary Tuesday morning, the kettle still cold on the stove, a sunbeam cutting through the kitchen window and catching the lace of the curtain like a small altar. I'd been on my feet for a long time that week, scrubbing, straightening, sorting through a shoebox of ancient letters. My knees ached the way they'd ached for years, and the sugar in my blood had a mind of its own. I swayed, blacked out for the breadth of a breath, and came to on the cool tile, my palm pressed to the floor as though it might steady me like prayer. When Jason and Danielle arrived that evening, days later than I would have liked but in plenty of time to make a scene, they brought the kind of concern that smells faintly of obligation. There were smiles that had been practiced and hands that hovered like houseguests unsure where to sit. Jason put his arm around me like he might fold me into a coat and carry me off to safety. Danielle peered at me with those careful eyes like someone trying to read a book through frosted glass. "We just want you to be safe," Jason said. It was a line that felt rehearsed, as if 100 well-meaning relatives had said it at 100 kitchen tables. "The house is a lot. Maybe someone could help for a little while." They used the word "we." They used help. They brought a Tupperware of soup and tucked napkins like talismans into my hands. They asked sharp, efficient questions about bills and whether I still drove. They suggested I rest and get checked out. All the while there was a quietness I couldn't name until later, a blankness in their conversation that felled me more thoroughly than any fainting spell. That evening they took me to a place that smelled of lemon cleaner and old fabric, beige halls, plastic urns of silk flowers, bulletin boards full of crossword puzzles half-solved in a looping hand. "It was only for a few days," Jason said, as if it settled the matter. He hugged me, his arms tight enough to bruise memory, and Danielle pressed a soft kiss to my cheek, the lip gloss cold and unfamiliar. They left, and the door clicked like a verdict. At first I thought it would be temporary. I thought one of those well-meaning mistakes would be untangled. But when I asked for a telephone that first morning, the nurse apologized and said visiting hours came mid-afternoon. When I asked to step outside for a breath of real air the first evening, someone explained the grounds were supervised and my disorientation made them nervous. When I asked to speak with the administrator, there was a slow, practiced patience, the kind you give to things you believe cannot be hurried. The paper they showed me the first night was the kind of thing no mother should ever see signed with her name if she hadn't put ink to it herself. Admissions forms, a power of attorney clause, checkboxes next to phrases I had never agreed to. My son's signature trailed across the page like a tidy lie. When I asked the nurse about it, she looked at me with a small, clinical sadness and said, "Your son told us you were having confusion episodes. He arranged long-term placement." I sat on that little twin bed in a room that held nothing familiar and felt a hollowness grow like frost. For 3 days I gathered nothing but patience. On the 4th day, the facility allowed me a thin, cheap phone with a cord that curled like a fossil. I called Jason and left message after message. "Mama here. I'm in the facility on Winthrop. Call me." The voicemail that came back the second time said, "We're sorry you're upset." And Danielle, who had sat on my kitchen floor years before to cry about marital strain, had somehow found the energy to block my number. That afternoon I asked for a spiral notebook from the activities cart and a pen. The volunteer brought one over with a kindly smile. She made small talk about the weather and the garden while I opened the first page and began to write, not letters, not pleas, but a list. Account numbers. Deed descriptions. Names of attorneys. The title to the house that had once been so full of laughter it would echo into creaky corners. Monica Reeves, my lawyer for nearly 20 years and the woman who'd rewritten my wills when my husband died and who'd refused to let me sign anything that didn't feel like sunlight. Addresses. Phone numbers. Facts laid out in neat, stubborn rows like soldiers. I was not about to be reduced to a whisper. Monica called back before noon the next day. I remember the way she said my name, an astonished, careful sound, like someone who had found an old jewelry box in the attic and suspected treasure. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Where are you?" I told her everything. The words came like a confession and like a promise. She listened, then instructed, then became more than an advocate. Monica came in, an unlikely storm in a sensible suit, briefcase in hand, and righteous indignation poured straight down her voice. She marched into that facility and demanded answers, and the rooms that had felt like a trap opened like curtains to a stage. She called them on forms that were forged, signed under doubt. She called a capacity evaluation from the facility's own physician who, after a private conversation and a careful battery of tests, wrote plainly that there were no signs of dementia. The fog lifted under the weight of paperwork and legal teeth. Within days, Monica filed motions that made their faces blanch. An emergency revocation of a power of attorney that I'd never signed, an immediate injunction on any transfers of property, and a complaint for elder exploitation and misrepresentation. The bank accounts Jason had thought he could commandeer were frozen until the courts untangled the knots. I left the facility with a bag Monica had packed, nothing glamorous, a sweater, a pair of slippers. The world felt both enormous and merciful the moment I stepped off that threshold. We did not return to the house that day. We didn't need to. Monica booked us into a modest extended-stay hotel. It was her idea to catch them off guard with a partition sale petition, the kind of legal hammer that would force an occupant to either prove rightness or move. If they refused to vacate, the law would step in. If they refused to cooperate, their actions would be disclosed in a courtroom in language that didn't soften anything: forgery, misrepresentation, elder exploitation. They served the papers early on a Tuesday. Danielle screamed at the process server. Jason went white and slammed doors. The spectacle was small and precise the way justice often is. He called me that night, voice raw. "Mom, we got a letter." "Is this real?" "Yes," I said. "You have 30 days to leave." He stammered. He said things that were meant to make me feel his pain, words baited with guilt, but I was nothing like the frightened woman I'd been in those hospital halls. Monica put a plan into motion that tasted like the fruit of every quiet sacrifice I'd made for him: the graduation suit bought with a pawned wedding band, the nights I stayed awake ironing shirts and praying pennies into sleep. We accepted a cash offer from a young couple who adored the arched hallway and the kitchen's old heart, and in less than 2 weeks, the house that had been my life was sold. I signed the papers with a pen that trembled not from fear but from the magnitude of what it meant. I watched the settlement wire into my account and felt a warmth I had not allowed myself to imagine. Monica asked me one night, leaning over papers at the hotel's tiny table, "What do you want to do with the money?" A mischievous, slow smile spread across my face. "We don't do anything fast," I said. "Revenge isn't soup. It's a slow braise." So we waited. We did not rush. We let the dust settle on the scandal and watched the neighbors whisper with the kind of satisfaction that sometimes sits in the chest like cheap brandy. We let them assume grief where there might have been cunning. And then, when the right moment came, I took a breath and bought the house next door. It was smaller than the one they'd flamboyantly appropriated, a single story with a stubborn rosebush at the corner and a porch that watched the other house like someone who remembers too much. I paid cash. Monica handled the orchids of paperwork. Signing my name to that deed felt like planting a stake in both earth and memory. I moved in slowly, carrying each box like a talisman. I set a pot of tea on the porch, put on my best Sunday hat, and watched the street as if nothing had happened. The first time Jason stepped out and saw me sitting on that porch, he froze. For a heartbeat he looked like a man who'd come upon a portrait he thought had burned. He turned and went back inside, like a person who'd suddenly remembered he'd forgotten something but couldn't remember what. Danielle pulled her curtains tight. But what I did next was softer than spectacle and crueler in its quiet. I planted roses along the fence, red as confession. I waved at the mailman. I introduced myself to the elderly widow 2 doors down who never, in all the years of their previous ownership, had been invited to tea. I baked banana bread for the young couple who'd bought the old house and gave them tips for keeping the original sash window from warping. Monica called me petty. I called it establishing a perimeter. I did not gloat. I simply existed on my porch like a stubborn promise. Danielle rattled their pots and bragged to friends who came for wine and cheap laughs about me. She's bitter, she's obsessed, as if anyone could be obsessed with a life they had taken from you. The neighborhood heard and watched. Their whispers turned into something stranger, a quiet awareness that grew in the spaces between hedges. Tyler, my grandson, noticed more than anyone. He began to walk over in the afternoons, backpack slung low, an awkward middle schooler who had been left to balance the weight of 2 unreliable adults. He sat on my porch once, drew in the air with a finger and said, "I heard." "I'm sorry." "You don't need to be," I told him. "You're not the one who made a choice." He asked a small, honest question that night as we ate sweet potatoes and stale jokes warmed into laughter. "Why did you buy the house next door?" He didn't sound like he wanted an apology. He wanted an answer. "To remind someone what looks back at you when you try to forget where you came from," I said. He snorted. "You're colder than I thought, Grandma." I laughed so hard my shoulders shook. It felt good to be laughed at by 14-year-old honesty. Jason's response to my new front row seat was an awkward stillness. He stopped speaking to me. He made himself small, avoiding eyes the way a man avoids scales. Danielle left sometimes for weekends that stretched into weeks. Their music parties dwindled. A for sale sign went up on their lawn, more a flailing than a plan, and one morning it was gone, not because a buyer came but because Danielle packed her car with lotions and a robe and left without glancing back. She drove away like someone who had not looked at themselves in the mirror for too long. Jason stayed. He sat like a person waiting for a thunderstorm to end. I watched him through the blinds sometimes, a silent witness to the consequences of taking the easy way out. There would be nights he sat on his porch with a beer and the kind of hollow that has no easy remedy. He looked tired in a way that doesn't heal with sleep. Tyler began sleeping at my house more often. He was a quiet companion who didn't need to be fixed. We planted marigolds and tomatoes and reasons to laugh. I showed him old photographs of his grandfather, told him stories about how the house used to smell of fresh-baked bread and long Sunday afternoons. He listened like someone inhaling a map. "You're not a burden," he whispered one night as I tucked him into the spare bed. "I know," I said. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I did not let them fall. I had let them fall in the nursing home alone, and I had sewn them into the hem of my resolve. This time, the tears were stitches in a life I was mending. There were afternoons when the street felt like a small choir of quiet justice. People would stop and chat, someone would invite me to a church bake sale, a deacon would pass along a casserole. The neighborhood began to tilt towards me again, like a community remembering its center. I made a small anonymous donation to the local senior outreach program, $10,000, because practical gratitude is sometimes the most brutal form of moral correction. Monica raised a brow. You're making them feel guilt and gratitude at once. Call it a civic hug, I said. The weeks passed. The house next door, once loud with Danielle's playlists and the clinking of too many wine glasses, grew quiet. The curtains were drawn. The portrait of a life built on borrowed authority began to look like a stage set after the actors left. Jason began to come to the porch sometimes, but not to speak. His presence was a punctuation mark that left a bruise. He came once to talk in earnest. He stood on my porch, hat in his hands like the confessions of a small child. I wanted to do right, he said. I thought I was doing right. You took me someplace I didn't want to be, I said simply. You wrote over my name. He looked at me with an exhaustion that felt like a penitence. I don't know what to do now. Then do nothing for me, I told him. Do something for yourself. Get honest. Find out who you are when you haven't arranged everything to your convenience. He tried to apologize, and the apology was a thing that dropped between us like an object neither of us could identify as real. I let him say the words he needed to say and then closed the door behind him. Some doors close like defeat, others close like a blessing. Tyler became my quiet joy. He would come in after school and unload homework and peer pressures at my kitchen table while I stirred soup. He used my good china sometimes like a child testing boundaries. Grandma, what's this? He asked, tapping a small silver locket. That's your grandfather, I said. Keep it. Promise me you'll keep the stories too. He promised and held the promise like a coin, heavy and warm in his palm. Legal closure came with the economy of paperwork and the cold arithmetic of estate planning. Monica drafted a new will. She listened to me talk about what mattered: trust funds for Tyler's education, a small house to call his when he turned 21, endowments for women who had been discarded. She drafted it with a meticulous kindness. Jason, in the end, received nothing. Not out of malice but out of the quiet algebra of consequences, of abandonment, of a child choosing convenience over compassion. When he learned about the will, his call was shaky and small. Is this real? He asked. Yes, I said. You put me away. You left me. You had years to do otherwise. I'm sorry, he said. The word was a small, thin thing, as true and insufficient as it was. I forgave you, I said, but forgiveness is not a balance sheet. He hung up. Time, it turned out, was an excellent nurse. It tended to bitterness like honey tends to a wound, not erasing it but helping it set into a new shape. Jason moved eventually, quietly. Some neighbors whispered Florida, some said he'd gone to work at a warehouse. I did not ask. I watched the neighborhood settle into a steadier rhythm, a life without the weight of loud, brittle performances. Spring arrived with a riot of color in my little garden. The roses along the fence bloomed like small, incandescent declarations. The tomatoes started to come in, fat and blushing. Tyler got better grades. He joined the youth gardening club at school, came home with muddy shoes and the kind of mischief that makes a house feel lived in. He told me things about his father that made me ache and then intelligently laugh, about the ways men invent problems they do not want to face. One day I was asked to speak at the community center's elder justice seminar. They wanted someone to talk about scams and power of attorney abuses, and the organizer said my story might help others who had sat in rooms that smelled like bleach and pity. I stood on a small stage in a fluorescent-lit room and told my truth. I spoke about the particulars, which papers to look for, how to check signatures, the importance of keeping lawyers in the loop, but I also spoke about the heart. They call us a burden, I said, and the room leaned in as if to catch a fragile thing. They call us senile. They smile while they pick at our names. But what they do not see is how deep our roots run. We are not debris to be swept away. We are seeds. They bury us because they want us quiet, but seeds remember how to be graves and how to be gardens. Women in the front rows wept. One came up to me afterward and hugged me so hard my ribs must have begged for mercy. "Thank you for telling me it was real," she whispered. They made me feel like I'd lost my mind. I thought of the nursing home, the sterile beds, the magazine racks that smelled faintly of regret. I thought of the night I sat and wrote numbers and names in a notebook and how that notebook had become a map back to myself. I thought of the way Monica had marched into rooms with a briefcase full of righteous paper and how small acts of legal courage are sometimes the only kind people understand. And yet the most exquisite victory had nothing to do with courts. It had to do with laughter. With Tyler's laugh, which cleaned the air like rain. With the way neighbors started to return courtesies and not look away. With the way I could sit on my porch and drink tea and feel that the world, while not cured of harm, had at least learned a new story about me. I gave away money not to spite Jason but because I knew that nothing undid me like becoming what I had been called. I wanted to ensure that other women could walk into rooms where paperwork was clear and hands were held. I endowed a grant at the community center in my name, the Mayfield Legacy Grant, specifically earmarked for older women at risk of exploitation. It felt excellent to create a little bureaucracy of decency. Jason's eventual absence was both choral and come down. He had been a loud presence in our lives for the wrong reasons. In leaving, he allowed a kind of quiet to fall into place that made room for repair. He called once in a while from a new phone number, voice polite, clipped. He wanted to know about Tyler. I told him Tyler was safe. He asked if he could visit. I told him he could meet Tyler in a neutral place if he wanted. He never did. Years passed like the slow, beautiful turning of pages. Tyler finished school. He went away to college with a scholarship that made both our shoulders relax. He called me on Sundays and told me about classes and about the girl he liked who made fun of his gardening addiction. I laughed and told him to win her with tomatoes. My hair went silver in the winter light. My knees complained less because I listened to them. I painted small canvases that smelled of turpentine and stubborn peace. One morning, I painted the house I had sold for a living memory, its windows misted with fog, a way to say what it had become for me, a beautiful thing haunted by choices. Once, when I was older in the way only years can make. A body older, Jason's shadow came to the porch one last time. He stood there and said he'd found a place to live, that he had been humbled in ways a man does not ask permission to be. "I'm sorry," he said again, and this time sorrow sat more like a true thing between us. "I believe you're sorry," I said. "You will carry that for the rest of your life, and that may be heavy enough punishment. Or it may be a teacher. I do not know. But whatever your next steps are, do not expect me to rescue you. My job was once to carry you. That season is over. We were polite strangers in the end." Civility is sometimes a softer form of love when trust cannot be rebuilt. Jason moved to a small house in Florida eventually, a place where the sun rubs itself into everything and makes people believe in second chances. He wrote a letter once, full of careful things. I read it and then recycled it. On the porch, as roses erupted and tomatoes ripened and a small radio played jazz from a copper tin, I thought about the woman I had been when I blacked out on the kitchen floor. I thought about the hands that had scrubbed the floors until they hurt, the nights I spent sewing life back from one thin thread, the wedding band pawned in a desperate winter, the graduation suit bought with meager pride. I thought about how easy it would have been to become small and bitter, to let their story be the only story anyone remembered. Instead, I grew a new chapter. When the end came, it was quiet as small bells. Tyler, a man now, sat with me in the bed I had chosen and held my hand the way I had once held his before he was old enough to know loss. He told me stories about his life, about a career he loved, about a child's small snore that sounded like sanding, and I listened until the words thinned. I had been a burden, they said at one time. They were wrong. I had been a life. I had been soil and sun and stubbornness. You were never a burden, Tyler whispered as the light thinned. You were my home. Maybe that was the cleanest truth of all, that homes are not just houses with roofs and halls. Homes are stories, stubborn and steady, that keep generations from being washed away. They are hands that wash dishes and hold a fevered forehead at 3 a.m. They are a woman who refused to be measured by someone else's convenience. I closed my eyes and let the roses send their perfume into the room. The world hummed with small, ordinary miracles, a mail truck's gentle thud, a neighbor's restrained laugh, a bird fretting in the pear tree, and I felt a peace so vast it might have been the beginning rather than the end. They had tried to bury me. They had misread a life made of grit and tenderness for a life that could be tucked away. But I was always, stubbornly, a seed.